Hello, welcome to Cranking It. A couple months ago, I finished my Alaska to Argentina ride. For 21 months, I rode and camped my way down the length of the Americas. Crossed 14 countries, 2 continents, and 5 long-distance bikepacking routes. And I rode the entire way on a bike that I built myself. Now that I'm back, I thought I would talk a bit about my bike build, how I picked out my components, and whether I was satisfied with my choices. Hopefully this will be of some use to other long-distance cyclists interested in customizing their own bike. My approach to bike building was informed by the kind of terrain that I expected to ride and how fast I wanted to go. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to ride a lot of unpaved bikepacking routes. I also knew that I would be bringing video equipment with me to document my ride, so I expected it to be heavier than normal. As such, I knew that I wanted wide tires in a strong steel frame. I also knew that much of the ride would be on pavement, so I wanted a comfortable upright geometry. And I knew I would be riding long stretches in third world countries, so I wanted components that could be easily replaced in the small bike shops that I could find there. So those were my priorities as I started building out my bike: comfort, durability, and compatibility. And I still think those are the most important aspects of a bike, but looking back now, there are a few things I would have done differently. Let's start with the most fundamental component of a bicycle: the frame. The frame dictates almost everything about the rest of the bike: tire clearance, the style of brakes, and the kind of posture you want while riding. It's also the hardest part to replace mid-tour, so it's essential that it be strong enough to undergo the rigors of whatever terrain you decide to attempt. I decided to order a custom frame from a local bike fabricator here in Seattle called Rodriguez. They specialize in building strong, custom steel frames for around-the-world tourists like myself. When I went in for my fitting, I told the salesman about the trip I was doing, and he encouraged me to upgrade from the Adventure model to the heavy-duty UTB model, which wasn't cheap, but it was designed specifically for rough roads and heavy cargo. I was pretty happy with it until about halfway through Mexico when the down tube cracked.
It seems my frame just straight up cracked in half. So, I'm gonna have to figure out how to deal with that now.
I managed to get a ride to the closest village, where a local welder patched it together. This let me ride to the next town, where I took a bus to Mexico City and had the cracked down tube removed and fully replaced at a frame building shop there. I contacted Rodriguez, and they did agree to reimburse me the cost of the repair, which was around $400. I was still pretty disappointed, since this wasn't just some random old frame I had lying around. It was specifically built for this exact use, but it still failed. The new down tube held up all the way to Ecuador, where it broke in the exact same spot.
Once again, it seems my frame has cracked in the exact same spot.
After that, my dad helped me fortify the spot with a shim cut from a bicycle he bought at a scrapyard. I still have no idea why my frame broke at that exact spot, not once, but twice over the course of my ride. On future rides, I probably won't be using a Rodriguez frame. I'm just glad it was steel, which made it so much easier to repair both times. My fork was the Troll fork from Surly. I chose it for its reputation for strength, as well as the numerous brace-ons, allowing for any type of configuration of front-mounted cargo. I didn't feel like I had enough gear to justify front panniers, so I mounted my tent and pad directly onto the fork using cargo cages. This worked fine until southern Mexico, when one of the cages ripped off the fork, leaving 2 ragged holes.
Cradle just pulled right off of the fork itself. This is where it used to be, and now there's 2 giant holes in my fork. Just big old gaping holes.
I got the holes welded closed in San Cristobal de las Casas. A few weeks later, in Costa Rica, I decided to swap to an Old Man Mountain front rack, since that seemed stronger, and I ended up having no more issues on that front. For my wheel set, I decided to go with 26-inch wheels with rim brakes. My thinking was that size and style would make it easier to find replacement parts in the small towns and villages I would be traveling through in Latin America. It turned out that wasn't exactly true. Bike shops are fairly common, and in major cities, modern bike parts weren't hard to find. A few times, it was actually easier to find 29-inch tubes and tires, and almost every bike I saw had disc brakes. Like my frame, I wanted to make sure my wheels were solid and reliable for the entire tour, so I actually had them built for me at a local bike shop. They ordered a pair of Velocity Cliffhanger rims, which have a great reputation for reliability, Wheelsmith double-butted spokes, 36 per wheel, and a Hope RS4 for the rear hub. For the front, I decided to use a Sun 28 Dynamo hub. As I started out, I was hopeful these top-of-the-line wheels would carry me all the way to Ushuaia. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out that way. After finishing the Great Divide Trail, I went in for a tune-up, and the mechanic said that I had spoke hole cracks on my rear rim. I decided to just order a new wheel. My new wheel lasted me until the crossing from Panama to Colombia, where salt water must have gotten into the hub and caused it to fail. Fortunately, there was a mechanic in town who was able to replace it, and I got right back on the road. That hub worked great all the way to Argentina, where the spoke holes cracked. I had to hitch a ride into the closest town, where again, a local bike shop had a compatible hub and swapped it out. My fancy cliffhanger rims both wore out in Peru. One in the middle of nowhere, requiring a couple hitches into town, and one just outside of Cusco. In both cases, a crack appeared on the braking surface, and in both cases, a local bike shop was able to sell me a new rim. As for the dynamo hub, I thought I would need it to charge all my cameras and electronics. But it turned out that after finishing the Great Divide route in the US, I never used it. As wild camping spots became more scarce and cheap hotels became more common, it wasn't hard to just keep my backup battery charged. In Chile, during a tune-up, the mechanic recommended I swap it out, and I agreed. It does produce some drag even when not plugged in, and I wasn't using it to charge stuff anyway. I've been a long-time defender of rim brakes. I think their stopping power is sufficient, and I appreciate how easy they are to adjust and replace. But on my next tour, I think I'll swap to disc brakes. Replacement brake pads are just as easy to source, and they put less wear on the rims. Actually, by the end of the ride, both of my hubs had disc mounts, just because that's what was available when I had to replace them. If I was using disc brakes, I would still want to use cables instead of hydraulics. There were hydraulic parts available, but only in the big cities. Cables can be found anywhere, and they're pretty easy to replace on the road. I have heard of some people touring on tubeless tires, but I don't regret using tubes. The tires I started out with were 2.3-inch Schwalbe pickups. They're technically e-bike tires, so they're a bit heavier, but I figured they would be pretty strong, especially with my heavier rig. The tread is also pretty smooth, making it better for the long stretches on pavement. I was hoping that with the increased weight would come better puncture protection. They weren't completely immune to punctures, especially in New Mexico, where I was getting flats almost daily. Fortunately, that changed after I completed the Great Divide and got a pair of extra thick slime-filled tubes. With those, I was able to ride the entire Baja Divide without getting a single flat, as well as most of the rest of Mexico. Eventually, even they gave out, and I was back to using normal tubes and patching the occasional flat. If I had gone with the tubeless setup, I obviously wouldn't need to patch so many tubes, but it's unlikely I would have ridden the whole way without some kind of issue, and at least with tubes, I know what to expect and how to repair them. If you're comfortable with the ins and outs of tubeless, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to ditch the tubes. I did notice sealant and tubeless tire repair products at most of the bike shops that I visited. One component I'm still on the fence about are fenders. I guess they're good for keeping my legs dry in the rain, and for keeping my drivetrain clean over the long term. But in really muddy conditions, the fenders can fill with mud and completely halt progress, which happened a couple times. Over the long term, they can get bent and rub against the tire, which is just another thing to maintain. I guess they're technically a good idea, it's just the only time I noticed them is when they were causing me problems. For gearing, I wanted to make sure I had a sufficiently low gear ratio to get up the steep rocky tracks common on bikepacking routes. I chose a 9-speed 11 to 34 tooth cassette and a triple crank with 22, 32, and 42 teeth chain rings. This gave me the largest possible range without using a specialty derailleur. Though honestly, if there was one major change I would make to my bike build, it would be to ditch the derailleur entirely and try out an internal shifter. The derailleur always seemed to be the most delicate part of the bike. In muddy conditions, it got clogged with grime, and anytime the bike was dropped or hit, I was afraid the hanger was going to bend and require precise adjustment. It also did break a couple times. Normally I stay away from components that I can't repair myself, but what I've heard about internal gearboxes is they just don't break. Do you have an internal gearbox? I'd love to hear about your experience. I was pretty happy with my handlebars. In the past, I used standard drop bars because that's just what came with the bike. After a few tours, I realized I was hurting my neck. Since I was leaning forward all the time, I had to keep my head bent back to see where I was going. And after hours in that position, my neck started to get pretty sore. The solution was to raise my handlebars and switch to wide flat bars so that I could sit upright in a more natural pose. The bars I ended up with were the Jones H-bars. After a couple test rides, I knew I liked it, but I missed having the option for a lower position when riding down hills or into headwinds. So I added some aero bars that I found at a used parts shop. It looks a bit silly, but after trying them out, I knew I could never go back. It's not so much being aero that matters, but rather having a second position. I used to think that drop bars had all sorts of positions, but I realized there's actually just one, and that is to hold the handlebars with your hands. The aero bars allow me to hold them with my elbows, giving my wrists a much needed break. My shifters are also a bit non-standard. Again, I used to use integrated STI shifters because that's just what came with the bike. Everybody used them, so I figured they were the best. That was until I broke one in the middle of Albania. I realized I didn't know how they worked and had no idea how to fix them. As soon as I got home, I switched to bar-end lever shifters. They're super simple, it's just a cable attached to a lever. Super easy to understand, super easy to take apart and put back together. Now that I have flat bars instead of drop bars, I mounted them by my brakes. The saddle is maybe the most important choice on a long-distance bike tour. The quality of other components don't directly affect the comfort quite so much as the saddle. A sore butt can ruin an otherwise nice bike ride. It's probably the main reason people cite for being reluctant to go out on long rides. I used to just use the stock saddle, which definitely left me sore after a day of riding. It got to be so that I was sore as soon as I got on the bike in the morning. Even sitting on chairs was painful after a couple weeks of riding. For this ride, I invested in the Brooks B17 leather saddle, and I have to say, it made all the difference in the world. It started out pretty stiff, but after riding on it for about 10 days, it softened enough to conform to my body. Once that happened, I was no longer sore after a day of riding. I never really got sore for the entire ride. Leather saddles aren't for everyone. They certainly require a bit more work to maintain, and you can't leave them out in the rain. But I would say if butt pain is an issue for you on these long rides, definitely try out a leather saddle. The components that served me best were the ones I never had to think about because they always just did their job and never broke. My rear rack falls into that category. It's just a Surly rack that I found in a used parts bin at a bike shop. I recognized the brand and figured it must be sturdy, and it was. My rear panniers carry the majority of my cargo weight, including my tools and my laptop computer, and my rear rack never had a single issue. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about my kickstand. Now I know kickstands can be a bit controversial. I've met some people who seem to have nothing but disdain for kickstands, and I used to be the same way. But as soon as I tried one out on my bike, I realized I could never go back. I used to just lean my bike on its side or against a tree, but sometimes there is no tree, and when the bike is on its side, it's hard to access both panniers. The convenience of being able to stand my bike up wherever is totally worth the occasional repair. I started out with a Jumbo Evo double-legged kickstand, but that turned out to be too narrow when folded up. I've replaced it with a scissors-style double-leg kickstand that folds both legs up on one side. I don't deny there are some drawbacks to this style of kickstand. It's not the most stable, so in strong winds sometimes it falls over. Also, it can only be deployed from the left side and retracted from the right. On the other hand, this meant it acted like an anti-theft feature because nobody else could figure out how to retract it. Another underappreciated component on touring bikes is the mirror. It's not the most important feature and has little use on bikepacking routes, but when sharing the road with other cars, it's nice to know how many cars are about to overtake you. For pedals, I just use flat mountain bike pedals. I used to use clip-on pedals, but I never really felt like they helped much. Even on paved roads, pulling up on the pedal just didn't feel very efficient, and it made my legs sore. On bikepacking routes, of course, they're just a hindrance. So that's the bike. I certainly wouldn't call it the perfect bike, but it did get me all the way to Ushuaia. At times, it kind of felt like the bike of Theseus, with how many components broke and had to be replaced. But truthfully, I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect bike. My main advice for someone interested in building their own bike, or even choosing a bike for a long adventure like this, is mostly just choose something that you're comfortable working on, fixing, and modifying as you go. Also keep in mind that you don't need the perfect bike to have a successful ride. A years-long bike tour across the Americas is going to be incredibly difficult no matter what your setup. There's no tire width or drivetrain component that will make it easy. It's definitely easy to spend a lot of money on tiny improvements which are not worth it in my opinion. I've seen people riding clunky old frames with 5-gallon buckets instead of panniers, people pulling massive trailers, or riding with a dog. I saw other people with super tight, lightweight setups with everything optimized. One is no better than the other, in my opinion. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide what direction you want to go, and whatever you decide, I can guarantee your bike will look substantially different after the ride is over.
Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Quick life update. It's been about a year now since I got back from my trip. In that time, I've gotten a job. I've been cleaning airplanes at the airport and saving up money for my next trip, which is going to be Japan. I plan on riding it from the northernmost point to the southernmost point this fall. So that'll be
early September to late November, about 2.5 months of riding. It's a significant step down in terms of difficulty from my previous trip, but I've heard so many great things about Japan. It's been on the bucket list for a long time. Also on the bucket list is more cross-continental trips. Someday I'd love to do Norway to South Africa as well as Portugal to Singapore. But those are both massive trips that will require tons of planning and saving. So it might be a bit before I get to those. But Japan this fall. I won't be editing on the road like I did last time. I'll be editing after I get home. So look out for those videos this winter. Thank you so much for sticking with the channel and helping support.